Atheist talk show host mocked Pope Francis on live TV. Is that all faith is? Fairy tales in robes? He smirked. Pope Francis looked up and gave a reply no one could laugh at. Before we reveal the full story, hit that like button and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Now let's get into it. They called it the Crossroads Dialogue, a sleek, internationally syndicated talk show that had once hosted presidents, Nobel laureates, even the Dalai Lama. But tonight's episode was different. The stage felt sharper somehow, the lighting colder. And the host? Well, let's just say he'd sharpened his knives. Alex Ryan adjusted his cufflink just before the red light blinked to life. No notes on his desk. He didn't need them. This wasn't going to be a debate, he'd told his producers. It was a civil conversation. The topic, faith in a rational age. But everyone on the production floor knew exactly what that meant. It meant fireworks. It meant theology under a microscope. And it meant Alex, an Oxford-educated best-selling author and outspoken atheist, would be the one holding the scalpel. His producers had somehow secured a remote guest who needed no introduction. Pope Francis himself. The live feed would broadcast directly from a Vatican study room. Plain, cream-colored walls with a simple wooden crucifix behind him, the Pope in his usual white cassock, looking somehow both ordinary and extraordinary at the same time. They had all agreed in advance. No hot-button politics, no doctrine debates, no scandal questions. This was meant to be an exploration of ideas. But Alex had a reputation to uphold. He was the man who broke down belief with logic, and the idea of treading lightly, especially with a figure like the Pope, felt to him like censorship wearing a polite tie. As the opening theme music faded out, Alex leaned into his mic with that trademark grin, practiced to the millimeter, just the right blend of charm and challenge. Good evening and welcome. Tonight we ask a simple question. In a world of science, reason and evidence, is there still room for faith? The camera swept across the panel, two renowned professors with best-selling books of their own. A young priest from New York with a podcast that had gone viral last summer. A soft-spoken rabbi who'd recently made headlines for his interfaith work. And then the screen split to include a live stream from Rome. Pope Francis appeared, seated calmly, his eyes warm and somehow unreadable at the same time. He nodded once, as if to say, "I'm ready." No one could have guessed that by the end of the hour, it wouldn't be the Pope answering questions, it would be Alex. Alex Ryan had built a reputation as the man who could out-argue anyone in the room and make it entertaining to watch. He didn't yell. He didn't mock, at least not openly. His weapon was poise, a surgical kind of logic that slipped beneath people's defenses before they realized they were bleeding. To his millions of followers, he was a truth-teller, a modern philosopher who asked hard questions that institutions dodged. But behind the applause, behind the bestsellers and speaking fees, Alex carried something else, something heavier than fame. He hadn't always been hostile toward faith. As a boy growing up in Liverpool, he had attended Mass every Sunday with his mother. She'd kept a rosary in her coat pocket, a worn thing of wooden beads and tarnished links, and whispered to it on buses. When she died suddenly, when Alex was just 13, it was a priest who came to the hospital, offered him a hug that smelled of incense and said, "God has a plan." Alex never forgot those words, or the fury they sparked inside him, hot and sudden, like a match dropped in dry grass. By 21, he had abandoned the church completely. By 25, he'd published his first book, Faith is a Fairy Tale, which made him a household name and a lightning rod for both praise and condemnation. The book wasn't angry, though. It was clean, clinical. It dismantled stories like Noah's Ark, transubstantiation, and miracles with the same matter-of-fact tone someone might use to explain why we don't believe in Santa anymore. And the public couldn't get enough. But what they didn't know, what the cameras never caught, was that the rosary his mother carried still sat in a drawer in his apartment. He hadn't thrown it away. He never could quite bring himself to do it. Tonight's episode, though, wasn't about grief. It was about performance. Alex had prepared clever questions, moments that would draw gasps or applause. He didn't hate Pope Francis. In fact, he secretly respected the man's consistency, his commitment to the poor. But respect didn't mean immunity from scrutiny. Alex saw religion as theater, and tonight he intended to be the one holding the script. The panel exchanged awkward greetings, and the cameras adjusted focus. Alex glanced at the monitor showing the Pope's video feed. Francis was smiling gently at something off-screen, perhaps an aide or technician, completely unaware, or maybe completely unbothered, by the storm he was about to walk into. Alex leaned back in his chair, cleared his throat, and said quietly, to himself, "Let's see what truth sounds like when it doesn't have a pulpit to hide behind." The show opened like any other, smooth, confident, every second choreographed to the beat of ratings and reputation. Studio lights swept across the audience, catching flashes of nervous smiles and raised eyebrows. The stage itself gleamed under cool blue tones, with each guest seated in a semicircle around Alex Rhine, who welcomed viewers with that familiar half-grin that said, "I know exactly what I'm doing, and you're about to enjoy watching me do it." "Tonight," he began, voice like honey over broken glass, "we ask a question that's either 2,000 years old or just 2 days too late. In a world defined by science, technology, and truth at our fingertips, what role, if any, should faith still play?" He turned slightly toward the screens where Pope Francis appeared from Rome, his image steady and warm, framed by a modest bookshelf and that simple wooden crucifix. "Joining us from the Vatican," Alex continued, "is someone whose name needs no introduction. Your Holiness, thank you for being here." Francis gave a small nod. "Thank you for the invitation," he said, his accent soft but clear. Dialogue is never wasted. The audience reacted with soft applause, uncertain, respectful. It was clear from the start. Francis wasn't here to spar. He was here to speak, to listen. The conversation began smoothly enough. A philosopher from Cambridge made a case for secular ethics, rational, reasonable. A rabbi countered with the enduring value of ritual, how tradition anchors us in chaos. The young priest, Father Leo, offered a moving anecdote about a mother in hospice care who found peace only after a prayer. The balance was delicate, respectful. Like guests at a dinner party carefully passing the salt, Alex let it all unfold. He nodded, interjected only slightly. He was waiting, timing the moment like a violinist holds a bow just above the strings, feeling for the perfect second to strike. Then came the pivot. "So," he said, addressing the Pope directly, voice dropping to that intimate register that told viewers something real was about to happen. "Your Holiness, do you believe faith has never harmed anyone? That belief, by definition, is always good?" There was a pause, not long but deliberate. You could almost hear the audience collectively hold their breath. Francis folded his hands, weathered hands not manicured like Alex's. "Faith, true faith, never seeks to harm," he said quietly. "But what we call faith is sometimes merely fear, dressed in holy words. And yes, fear has done much harm." Alex raised an eyebrow. "Interesting distinction. Because if we're honest, hasn't religion, your religion, also been used to justify silence, exclusion, even war?" The atmosphere shifted. The audience grew still. Father Leo blinked, his fingers tightening slightly on his armrest, and Alex pressed on, voice soft but loaded like a gun. "At what point does belief become a liability?" Francis didn't flinch. He simply looked directly at the screen, as if he could see past the camera to Alex himself. "Perhaps," he said gently, "when we stop believing that questions are sacred too. For the first time that evening, Alex Ryan didn't have a comeback ready. Not yet anyway. It started with a chuckle. Just a small one. That little sound Alex made. When he thought he'd caught someone in circular logic, he shifted in his chair, fingers steepled under his chin. "Forgive me, Your Holiness, but I must ask, how do you reconcile representing a church that still teaches, quite literally, that bread becomes flesh, in a world where even 10-year-olds are building robots and coding games?" A few audience members laughed nervously. Pope Francis smiled, not with amusement, but with the patient look of someone who's heard this question in 100 different forms. "That mystery," he replied, "has less to do with chemistry and more to do with surrender." Alex's smile sharpened. But surrender to what exactly? Stories? Symbols? The idea that suffering is meaningful because someone 2,000 years ago died on a cross? Isn't that just poetic insulation from reality? He wasn't shouting. He didn't need to. The scalpel was out now. Precision over volume, every word carefully chosen. "I'm not attacking you personally," he said, hands open in a gesture of faux innocence. "But when a child is abused, when cancer takes a mother of 3, when floods drown entire cities, and all we offer is prayer, doesn't that look like fairy tales in robes trying to manage chaos with poetry?" The air in the studio went thin, charged. Someone in the front row shifted uncomfortably. Pope Francis didn't respond immediately. He closed his eyes for a moment, not dramatically, but like someone collecting his thoughts, then opened them slowly. "May I tell you something?" he asked. Alex gestured, palm up. "Of course." Francis began. "Years ago, in a hospital outside Buenos Aires, I sat beside a man named Manuel. He was 31, a mechanic with grease still under his fingernails. His lungs were failing from a disease no one expected. His wife stood beside me, holding their baby girl who was too young to understand. I had no answers to give them, so I held his hand. We wept together, and just before he passed, Manuel whispered, 'Thank you for staying. Not for healing, not for hope, just for staying.'" He looked directly at Alex through the screen. "Faith is not about fixing. It is about staying." Alex hesitated. That wasn't the direction he'd expected. It wasn't in the script he'd mentally prepared. And what of the gold? He pivoted quickly, regaining ground. The marble, the robes, the cathedral ceilings, all that wealth when people can't afford bread? Francis answered without delay. The church must always be challenged to live closer to the poor. And when we fail at that, and we often do, we fail at being church. The audience was utterly still now. This wasn't the defensive reaction they'd anticipated. Alex leaned back slightly, regrouping. "So you admit the institution is flawed?" "I do," Francis replied simply, "because it is made of people. But if we throw away every flawed thing, we may find ourselves without even a mirror to see ourselves clearly." That line landed harder than anything Alex had planned for. For a few seconds, he said nothing at all, but something had shifted in the studio, and it wasn't in the Pope. Alex folded his arms, letting silence build like a drum roll before the final act. His next words were quieter, less performance, more personal, catching even his producers off guard. "Your Holiness, with respect," he began, a slight edge in his voice. "When my mother was dying, the priest told her to offer it up, that her pain would purify her soul." His eyes narrowed slightly. "I remember thinking, what kind of God demands pain as tribute?" He didn't blink. "I was 12, and I hated him for it." You could hear the breath catch in the audience, the tiny gasps of recognition. This wasn't in the program guide. Pope Francis didn't recoil or launch into a theological defense. He didn't quote scripture or offer platitudes. He simply looked at Alex the way a grandfather might look at a wounded child. full of genuine sorrow, not condescending pity. "I am sorry," he said, each word weighted with sincerity, "not only for your loss, but for the words you were given instead of comfort." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had shifted, more personal, less formal. "I do not fear your questions, Mr. Rhine. I have asked them myself, many times, and I still do." Alex blinked, caught off guard by the admission. "There is no equation that makes death neat," Francis continued. "No explanation that makes cancer just. When I was a parish priest, I sat by a woman named Lucia as she buried her only son. She held his school backpack in her lap throughout the entire funeral. I said nothing. What could I possibly say that wouldn't sound hollow?" He looked down, briefly. "She said to me, if God is real, he better be crying too." Francis met Alex's eyes through the screen. "That's the only God I believe in, the one who cries with us." For once, Alex's face changed, not in frustration or skepticism, but in confusion. Vulnerability flickered across it like a shadow passing over water, unscripted, unplanned. "You're saying faith is grief?" he asked, sounding genuinely perplexed. "I'm saying faith is presence," Francis answered. "Sometimes God is not the voice that answers. He is the silence that stays when everyone else has left." The young priest on the panel wiped his eye quickly, hoping no one would notice. Even the usually composed rabbi beside him nodded slowly, a gesture of deep recognition. Alex opened his mouth to speak, but for a moment no words came. Then, finally, he managed, "That's not what I expected to hear tonight." Francis smiled, gently. "Neither is grace. That's how it finds us, when we least expect it." Alex looked down at his notes. They suddenly felt irrelevant, like tools for a job he no longer wanted to finish. "Fair enough," he muttered, half to himself. But everyone in the audience knew something had landed, something quiet and real that no clever comeback could touch, and Alex Rhine, professional disassembler of belief, was no longer the one leading the conversation. The lights hadn't changed. The cameras kept rolling, red lights blinking steadily, but something in the room had shifted, subtly but irrevocably. Alex sat quieter now, his fingers no longer drumming the table's edge. He wasn't watching the Pope's image on the screen anymore. He was looking past it, somewhere else entirely, somewhere years ago. He was 13 again, sitting on a hard plastic bench in a sterile hospital corridor, the scent of antiseptic and day-old coffee curling in the air like fog. The rosary his mother always kept in her coat pocket had been handed to him by a nurse with sad eyes, silent, unsure what else to do. He didn't pray with it, just clenched it in his fist, hard enough to leave imprints on his palm that lasted for hours. The priest who came didn't know him or his mother. He wore cologne that smelled wrong in that place of illness. He used the phrase, "God's will," 3 times in 2 minutes. Alex remembered nodding and saying nothing at all, then later throwing the rosary in a drawer he never opened again. Until this morning, back in the studio, his throat felt tight. Not from emotion, at least that's what he told himself. From restraint. From the weight of a story he'd never told. In public, not to fans, not to friends, not even to the ghostwriters who had helped him package his grief into bestseller chapters about rationality. He looked toward the Pope's image again. Francis was speaking gently now with the rabbi about shared suffering in both their traditions. Alex wasn't listening to the words. He was listening to the tone. It wasn't performance, it wasn't polish. It was a man who knew what mourning sounded. Like when it had run out of language. That's what unsettled him most. Not the theology, not the parables, but the absence of defense. Francis hadn't tried to win, and that was completely disarming. Alex felt a quiet ache in his chest, sharp but familiar, like an old injury that flares in damp weather. The kind that doesn't hurt from impact, but from memory. His mother's voice echoed somewhere in his mind. Not a prayer, just her humming in the kitchen while waiting for tea to steep. It wasn't belief he missed. It was her. He leaned forward slightly, his voice soft, almost unsure, nothing like the confident host who had started the evening. "Do you think grief is ever finished? Really finished?" Francis looked back at him through the screen. The distance between Rome and the studio suddenly feeling both vast and non-existent. "No," he said simply, "but it becomes less lonely when someone stays beside it." Alex swallowed hard. He didn't know what he was anymore. Host, skeptic, public intellectual, or just a man sitting with the past. Whatever he was, the armor he'd worn for 20 years was no longer holding the same shape, and for the first time that night he didn't reach for another question. He just sat in the quiet. The silence in the studio was no longer awkward. It was reverent. Even the hum of production equipment seemed to hush itself. Alex glanced down at his notes again, but they were no longer cues or talking points, just ink on paper, meaningless against what had just been said. He cleared his throat. "You said earlier that faith is presence, that God is silence that stays." "Yes," Pope Francis replied. Alex leaned forward, a hint of his old challenge returning, but changed somehow. "But silence doesn't save anyone, does it?" Francis's expression didn't change. "That depends," he said carefully, "on what you mean by save." Alex opened his hands in a quiet shrug, a gesture both dismissive and genuinely questioning. From pain, from death, from injustice, all the things faith claims to confront. If God is real, why doesn't he intervene? The Pope nodded slowly, as if he'd carried that question like a pebble in his shoe for decades. "I do not know," he said, the admission startlingly frank. "I have seen children die. I have seen families torn apart by war and addiction. I have buried friends who deserved longer lives, and I have prayed in hospital corridors where no miracle came." He looked directly into the camera. "But I have also seen a stranger hold a weeping mother for hours, a doctor stay past his shift until a family arrived. A man bring soup to someone who had shouted at him the day before." Francis leaned in slightly. "And I have seen hearts change, not from thunder or proclamations, but from listening." He paused, and the question that followed wasn't accusatory, but genuinely curious. "Would you still mock a man who simply cries with you when your world falls apart?" The question was a scalpel without a handle. No malice, no accusation, just depth. Alex didn't answer. He couldn't. Behind him, one of the camera operators stepped back slightly and gently lowered her head. On the edge of the audience seating, a man with a business suit and expensive watch blinked rapidly, brushing at his eye with the heel of his palm. Even the young priest, who had come prepared with quotes and commentary, sat with his lips pressed together, hands clenched in his lap. Alex finally found his voice, low and rough at the edges. "I've spent my whole career trying to replace belief with knowledge, to help people see the world as it really is." Francis responded without hesitation, and perhaps today the world revealed itself in a way no knowledge can fully contain. That line didn't land like a mic drop or a clever comeback. It landed like a hand on a shoulder in a dark room, no fireworks. Just a stillness that stretched between them, not because the conversation had ended, but because something else had just begun. The red light on the main camera blinked off. A small chime signaled the end of the broadcast, and the applause, gentle, uncertain, almost reverent, rose and fell like a tide unsure of itself. Crew members moved around with practiced ease, but something in their movements was different. Slower, less mechanical. Alex Rhine didn't move. He sat in his chair long after the others had stood. The panelists offered polite nods and shuffled. Backstage, murmuring quietly to each other, the Pope's screen faded to black. No final sign-off, no formal goodbye, just a faint smile and a quiet nod before the feed ended. Alex exhaled, not dramatically, just a breath that had been waiting its turn. He walked off set without a word and disappeared down the side hallway toward the dressing rooms. An intern offered him a water bottle. He took it absently, forgot to open it. Inside, the quiet of his private green room, he sat on the edge of the couch, elbows on his knees, hands loose and tired. And there it was, the rosary, still in his jacket pocket. He hadn't meant to bring it to the studio. It had been tucked away during a recent move, rediscovered in a box marked simply Misk. The beads were dull now, the crucifix slightly bent at the edges, worn by time and neglect. But it was intact, familiar, heavy, not with guilt but with history. He ran the strand through his fingers, feeling each bead click softly against the next. He didn't pray. He didn't need to. The weight of it in his hand was its own kind of confession, a knock on the door. A young staffer peeked in, hesitant. "Mr. Rhine, is everything all right? The car's waiting whenever you're ready." Alex looked up. His voice was soft, steady. "Everything's fine, I'll be out in a minute." She paused, then added almost shyly, "You were really something tonight." "It wasn't what I expected." He gave a faint smile. "Not sure what I was, to be honest." She nodded, unsure how to respond to this version of her usually confident boss, and slipped away. Alex sat in the quiet. The walls buzzed faintly with fluorescent hum. Outside, the cleaning crew moved from room to room. The world was already resetting, moving on, but he wasn't, not yet. He looked down at the rosary again, thumbed the first bead, not to pray it, just to feel it, to remember. Not God, not doctrine, just a woman in a grey coat humming over a boiling kettle. Her hands, her voice, her. "I don't know what I believe," he whispered to the empty room. "But I heard something real today." He stayed there for a long time. No applause, no spotlight, just silence. And for the first time in his career, he let it be enough. If you were in Alex's seat, how would you have responded to Pope Francis's words? Do you think presence without answers is enough in moments of suffering? Let us know in the comments below. We read every single one, and if this story moved you even a little, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and tap the bell icon so you never miss an upload. Share this video with someone who's ever questioned faith, grief, or what it means to just stay. Our next story should be appearing on your screen now. Tap it to keep watching, and we'll see you tomorrow, same time, same place.